don't need to read Finnish to understand the front page of Tuesday's Kauppalehti newspaper. Trump 0, Putin 1. Helsinki's main business daily declared the morning after this city hosted a U.S. Russia summit unlike any before it. Kauppalehti's analysis that Russian President Vladimir Putin had gotten the better of U.S. President Donald Trump in Helsinki was shared almost worldwide. But while reaction in the United States was a mixture of shock and indignation at the deference Mr. Trump showed to Mr. Putin, by suggesting the US was to blame for frosty relations between the two countries and accepting Mr. Putin's denial that Russia interfered in the 2016 US election, the response in Europe was more fearful. And now, as a US ally, we are supposed to believe that if President Putin launches a hybrid war, or even a nuclear strike against Poland, President Donald Trump will threaten to nuke him back. Radosław Sikorski, a former Polish foreign minister, posted on his Twitter account shortly after the Helsinki summit ended with a startlingly chummy press conference by the US and Russian leaders. Mr. Sikorski's post was retweeted by Carl Bildt, a former Prime Minister of Sweden. This is, of course, a far more serious NATO credibility issue than the issue of defense spending, Mr. Bildt added. That was a reference to Mr. Trump's performance at last week's NATO summit in Brussels, the start of a disruptive 6-day trip through Europe. Mr. Trump rattled the other 28 leaders of the alliance by demanding that they dramatically increase their military spending and hinting that he could pull the US out of the alliance, which largely exists to deter possible Russian aggression, if they didn't. Mr. Trump followed it up with a visit to the United Kingdom, where he told an interviewer that he saw the European Union as America's foe because of what they do to us in trade. Russia, meanwhile, was only a foe in certain respects. Mr. Bildt, writing in the Washington Post, said that by not pressing Mr. Putin on issues such as Russia's annexation of Crimea, its support for Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad or its meddling in Western elections, Mr. Trump was effectively giving the Kremlin boss carte blanche to keep behaving in the same manner. Any reasonable Kremlin interpretation would be that Russia can go on pursuing its policies without significant White House objection. The bilateral relationship went from very bad to very good in those 4 hours without Russia announcing any concessions or course correction whatsoever, Mr. Bildt wrote. The Helsinki press conference crystallized the fear that was building in Europe since Mr. Trump's election. What if the president means what he says and really wants to break up the transatlantic alliance? Does the EU need its own army? We can no longer completely rely on the White House, German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas told an interviewer shortly before the Helsinki summit began. To maintain our partnership with the USA we must readjust it. The first clear consequence can only be that we need to align ourselves even more closely in Europe. Most nervous of all, unsurprisingly, is the government of Ukraine. President Petro Poroshenko, who attended the NATO summit, had been hoping to see Mr. Trump push Mr. Putin for the return of Crimea and an end to Russia's support for separatist fighters in the breakaway Donetsk and Lugansk regions of his country. Mr. Poroshenko got neither, and in the wake of the Helsinki meeting, he too took to Twitter in what appeared to be an effort to brace his country for yet more turbulence ahead. He warned that Russian military activity was increasing around Mariupol, a strategic Ukrainian port between separatist-controlled Donetsk and Russian-ruled Crimea. We will not tolerate Russian and foreign ships moving towards Ukrainian ports, Mr. Poroshenko wrote. We are ready to defend our land even if we must do it alone, without international support.